Have you ever been the one person in your family who just didn't fit in? The one they always looked down on, no matter how hard you tried? I lived that life for 28 years. I thought I had hit rock bottom the day my own father called me a useless failure at his birthday dinner. But I was wrong. Rock bottom was being banned from his will reading, only to find out they couldn't start without me. The air in the private dining room of the Gilded Steer was so thick with money you could practically smell it, a cloying mix of expensive perfume, aged leather, and the seared fat of overpriced steak. It was my father, Robert Vance's, 60th birthday dinner, an event planned with military precision by my mother, Carol, and executed with smug satisfaction by my sister, Brittany. I sat at the corner of the long, polished mahogany table, feeling like a weed that had sprouted in a perfectly manicured garden. My dress was nice, the nicest thing I owned, but next to Brittany's glittering designer sheath, it felt like a homespun rag. My father sat at the head of the table, a king on his throne, beaming as Brittany recounted her latest real estate conquest. And the final offer was 10% over asking, Brittany said, holding her wine glass aloft. The Henderson account is officially the most profitable single-family deal in the company's history. My father's chest swelled with pride. That's my girl, he boomed, his voice echoing in the hushed room. A killer instinct. That's what it takes to be a Vance. I took a small sip of water, the ice cubes clinking nervously against the glass. The words hung in the air, a declaration meant for the whole table, but a direct missile aimed at me. I had just been laid off from my job as a museum archivist. It was a job I loved, cataloging the city's architectural history, but it paid poorly and, in my family's eyes, was the final confirmation of my status as a professional disappointment. I was the artsy one, the one with hobbies instead of a career. Brittany's husband, Chad, a man whose spine seemed to have been surgically removed and replaced with a sycophantic urge to please, chimed in. Here, here, to Brittany, the rainmaker. He raised his glass, his eyes flicking to my father for approval. My mother smiled, a tight, practiced expression. We're just so proud of you, dear. You're building a real legacy. Then, Brittany turned her gaze to me, a cruel, knowing glint in her eyes. She stood up, raising her glass higher. I'd like to propose a toast, she announced. The whole table quieted. To Dad, on his 60th birthday. A man who taught me that success isn't given, it's taken. She paused, letting the words sink in. And to family. We're so glad the whole family is here to celebrate his success, even those who are still figuring out how to contribute. A few people chuckled, a low, uncomfortable sound. Chad laughed a little too loudly. My father smirked. My mother just stared at her plate. The heat rushed to my face, a burning, prickling wave of shame. I was a line item in her speech, a prop for her own success story, the before picture to her after. I felt my hands tremble under the table, so I clasped them together, digging my nails into my palms. Just get through this, Margaret. Just breathe. Later, as dessert was served, my father unveiled the centerpiece of his evening, a large architectural model of his next big project. The Vance Pinnacle, he announced grandly. It was a soulless glass and steel tower, destined to replace a block of historic, albeit rundown brownstone. It's going to be the tallest residential building downtown, he said with a greedy glint in his eye. I looked at the model, my archivist brain kicking in despite the humiliation. I knew that block, one of the buildings, had a rare cast iron facade, one of only 3 left in the city. An idea sparked, a desperate, foolish attempt to connect, to show them I wasn't useless. Dad, I began, my voice smaller than I intended. That's ambitious. I was just reading about that area. The Historical Society is trying to get landmark status for the old merchants building on the corner. If you offered to preserve the facade and integrate it into the new design, you could get significant tax breaks and a ton of positive press. It would probably even help you fast-track the permits. The table went silent. My father turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. He looked at the model, then at me. A deep, humorless laugh rumbled in his chest. Sentimental nonsense, he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. You and your dusty old buildings. This is the real world, Margaret. We tear down the old to make way for the new. That's how progress works. That's how money is made. He then leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, cutting tone that was somehow louder than his previous shouting. He looked me right in the eye, and the rest of the world seemed to fall away. It was just him and me, the judge, and the judged. Listen to me, he said, his voice laced with a final, weary disappointment. When I'm gone, Brittany will run this company. She understands what it takes, the inheritance, the legacy. It's for people who build things, not for those who live in the past. You're a failure, Margaret, a useless failure. The words, they didn't just hurt, they shattered something inside me. Failure. Useless. He said it so easily, so matter-of-factly, in front of everyone. I saw Brittany's triumphant little smile. I saw my mother look away, refusing to meet my eyes. I saw Chad staring at his fork, a coward to the very end. No one defended me. No one said a word. I was kicked out, not from the restaurant, but from the family, from their future, from their respect, from any hope of ever belonging. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. My legs felt like they were moving through water. Excuse me, I whispered, my throat tight. I walked out of the room, past the waiters, through the opulent lobby, and out into the cold night air. The city lights blurred through the tears welling in my eyes. I didn't look back. I was utterly, completely broken. I was a ghost at my own family dinner. The days that followed the disastrous birthday dinner were a thick, gray fog of misery. My tiny apartment, once a cozy refuge, now felt like a prison cell. The walls seemed to be closing in, whispering my father's words back to me. Useless. Failure. I'd scroll through job postings online, the descriptions blurring into an endless stream of requirements I didn't have and salaries I couldn't live on. My severance pay was dwindling, and a knot of pure, cold panic was permanently lodged in my stomach. I'd eat cheap ramen, the salty broth doing little to warm the chill that had settled deep in my bones. I was at the absolute bottom, convinced my family was right. I was a nobody, going nowhere. Just when I was about to surrender to the despair, to call Brittany and beg for some menial job at the company, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another bill collector, but something made me swipe to answer. Hello? I said, my voice hoarse. Am I speaking with Ms. Margaret Vance? The voice on the other end was old, calm, and cultured. It held a weight of authority that made me sit up a little straighter. Yes, this is she. My name is Alistair Finch. I was a close friend and the personal lawyer for your grandfather, William Vance. I believe you may remember me from your childhood. The name hit me like a splash of cold water. Alistair Finch. I had a vague, warm memory of a kind, silver-haired man who always smelled of old books and peppermint. He used to visit my grandfather when I was a little girl, and he was the only one of my grandfather's business associates who would crouch down to my level and ask me seriously about what I was reading. My grandfather, William, was the founder of Vance Properties, the one with the real vision. He passed away when I was 16, and the company and the family had felt colder ever since. I think so, yes, Mr. Finch. It's been a long time. Indeed, it has, Margaret, he said warmly. I'm calling because your grandfather entrusted me with a matter to be handled for you, and only you. Would you be available to meet with me at my office tomorrow morning? My mind raced. A matter for me. What could it possibly be? My family had made it clear that my grandfather's legacy belonged to them. I suppose so. Where is your office? He gave me the address of a prestigious building downtown, the kind of place I couldn't even afford to get a coffee in. I agreed, a strange mix of suspicion and a fragile, unfamiliar feeling of hope stirring in my chest. The next morning, I stood before the towering glass entrance of Finch, Sterling and Thorne. I felt deeply out of place in my simple black trousers and blazer. Alistair Finch's office was on the top floor. It was a beautiful space, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and smelling faintly of that same peppermint I remembered. Alistair rose from behind a large oak desk, his smile just as kind as I recall. He was older, of course, his hair now a brilliant white, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. "Margaret, thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to a plush leather chair. "Please sit." He didn't waste time with small talk. "Your grandfather was a brilliant man," he began, his voice soft but firm. "He built his company on a foundation of quality and respect for the city's history. He was deeply disappointed in the direction your father was taking the company in his later years. All flash, no substance. Risky, soulless projects that tarnished the Vance name." I listened, stunned. No one had ever spoken about my father this way. "William saw something special in you, Margaret," Alistair continued, his eyes meeting mine. "He saw his own passion. He used to call me after your family visits and tell me how you were the only one who asked about the old buildings, the only one with an eye for the bones of the city. He called your interest a gift." Tears pricked my eyes. To my family it was a childish hobby. To my grandfather it was a gift. Alistair reached into his desk and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. It was old and worn, embossed with my grandfather's initials, W.V. He slid it across the polished desk toward me. "Your father's will is what it is," Alistair said with a slight frown. "But your grandfather was a shrewd man. He prepared for this. This is not a will. It is the charter for a private trust he established for you years ago, to be activated at my discretion when I felt the time was right. I believe that time is now." My hand trembled as I opened the folder. Inside, it wasn't just documents. The first thing I saw was a stack of official-looking papers held together by a clip. On top, in bold letters, it said property deed. There were 5 of them. They were for small, dilapidated commercial buildings in overlooked, forgotten neighborhoods. I recognized the addresses. They were architectural gems, left to rot. Behind the deeds was a bank book. I opened it. The starting balance read $50,000. I looked up at Alistair, my throat too tight to speak. "It's not a fortune," he said gently. "It's seed money. William knew that if he just gave you a pile of cash, your father might find a way to take it. But property is tangible. It's a foundation. He bought these places secretly over a decade. Diamonds in the rough that he knew had potential. He believed that your useless passion for architectural history was actually the family's greatest hidden asset. He trusted that you would know what to do with them." I stared at the folder, at my name listed as the sole beneficiary of the trust. It was a secret inheritance, a lifeline thrown from the past by the one person who had always truly seen me. The panic in my stomach was still there, but now, it was mixed with something else, a terrifying, exhilarating spark of possibility. This wasn't just money and old buildings. It was a chance. It was a legacy. It was my grandfather's faith in me, made real. The next 6 months were a blur of organized chaos, a baptism by fire, dust and debt. The initial wave of exhilaration quickly gave way to the crushing reality of what I had taken on. $50,000 sounds like a lot of money, until you're staring at a crumbling brick wall, a leaky roof, and a plumbing system that looks like it was installed during the Civil War. The first property I chose to tackle was a 2-story corner building in a neighborhood called Oak Haven. It had once been a beautiful apothecary, with large glass windows and intricate ironwork on the facade, but now it was a boarded-up eyesore. My life became a repeating cycle of grueling days and sleepless nights. My tangible struggle was not a metaphor. It was written in the calluses on my hands and the persistent ache in my lower back. I became my own general contractor, plumber's assistant, and painter. I learned to spackle and sand, to rewire a light fixture without electrocuting myself, and to negotiate with surly suppliers who looked at me, a 28-year-old woman in paint-splattered jeans, and immediately doubled their prices. I spent my days covered in a fine layer of plaster dust, a smell that clung to my hair and clothes. My tiny apartment, once my prison, was now just a place to shower and sleep for a few precious hours before starting all over again. My nights were spent hunched over a second-hand drafting table, poring over blueprints and city permit applications. I navigated the labyrinthine world of zoning laws, building codes, and historical preservation guidelines. My passion for architectural history was no longer an abstract interest. It was a practical tool. I researched the building's original design, finding old photographs at the city archives, the very place I used to work, and became obsessed with restoring it to its former glory, but with modern functionality. The loneliness was a heavy cloak. There was no team, no support staff, just me. The weight of it all was immense. Every decision, every dollar spent, was mine to bear. There were days I would sit on the dusty floor, surrounded by debris and the overwhelming scale of the project, and just cry. The temptation to give up, to sell the building for a quick small profit and walk away, was a constant whisper in the back of my mind. Then came the moment of near failure. We, and by we I mean the one contractor I could afford to hire for the heavy structural work, discovered a massive problem. A main support beam in the basement, hidden behind a rotting wall, was cracked and dangerously unstable. The contractor, a grim-faced man named Sal, showed me the damage. "This ain't a patch job, miss," he said, shaking his head. "This has to be replaced. Custom steel beam, engineering consult, crane rental. You're looking at 20 grand, easy, maybe more. $20,000. The thous hit me like a physical blow. I had less than half of that left in the entire project budget. My carefully planned finances evaporated in an instant. This was it, the end of the line. I was going to fail, just like my father always said I would. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the invoice from Sal, my hands shaking. I was completely wiped out. Desperate, I did the only thing I could think of. I called Alistair. My voice cracked as I explained the situation, the shame and panic making it hard to breathe. I was ready to quit, to tell him I couldn't do it, that my grandfather had been wrong about me. Alistair listened patiently, his silence a comforting presence on the other end of the line. When I finished, a mess of tears and apologies, he didn't offer pity or platitude, and more importantly, he didn't offer me money. "Deep breaths, Margaret," he said, his voice calm and steady. "William didn't choose you because he thought it would be easy. He chose you because he knew you wouldn't break. Now, I'm not going to give you a handout, but I will give you a resource." He gave me a name and a phone number. "His name is Arthur Jenkins. He was your grandfather's favorite master carpenter for 30 years. He's retired now, but he owes your grandfather a few favors. Call him, tell him Alistair sent you." The next day, I met Arthur. He was a gnarled, tough old man, with hands like worn leather and eyes that saw everything. He walked through the building, his gaze missing nothing. He looked at the cracked beam, tapped the walls, and then looked at me. A long, appraising stare. "Your grandfather was a good man," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He gave me my start when no one else would." He then looked at my plans, at the historical photos I had pinned to wall. A slow smile spread across his face. "You got his eye, kid." He made me an offer. He would come out of retirement to supervise the work, calling in favors from his old crew, in exchange for a small share of the future profits. It was the lifeline I needed, but it still wasn't enough. To cover the costs, I had to sacrifice everything. I sold my car, a trusty old sedan that was my last real possession of value. I maxed out my 2 personal credit cards, the interest rates making me feel sick to my stomach. I was living on the absolute edge, deep in debt, and betting everything on this one crumbling building. I was a nobody, financially ruined and exhausted to the bone. But as I stood with Arthur, watching the new steel beam being lowered into place, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I was building something. It was mine, and I would not let it fail. The year that followed was the hardest and most rewarding of my life. Under Arthur's watchful eye and with my relentless dedication, the corner building in Oakhaven transformed. The rotten wood was replaced, the crumbling brick repointed, the intricate ironwork on the facade, which I had painstakingly stripped and repainted myself, gleamed in the sun. We restored the large storefront windows, creating a bright, inviting commercial space on the ground floor, and converted the upstairs into two beautiful modern loft apartments with exposed brick walls and reclaimed hardwood floors. It was a perfect blend of history and modern living. The transformation didn't go unnoticed. The neighborhood, once skeptical, began to buzz with excitement. Before the final coat of paint was even dry, I had a signed lease from a chic new bakery for the commercial space and had rented both apartments to young professionals for far more than I had dared to hope. The first rent checks arrived, and when I deposited them, my bank account, which had been a barren wasteland for so long, finally had a healthy, five-figure balance. I paid off my credit cards in one glorious transaction. I had done it. I had turned a profit. To celebrate, I decided to do something I hadn't done in a year: treat myself. I went to a nice cafe in a trendy part of town, the kind of place my sister Brittany loved. I was still in my work croaks, sturdy boots, worn jeans, and a simple Henley with a faint dusting of sawdust I'd failed to brush off my shoulder. I was tired, my muscles ached, but as I sat there, sipping a ridiculously expensive latte, I felt a deep, quiet pride. "Margaret, is that you?" I looked up, my heart sinking. It was my brother-in-law, Chad. He was dressed impeccably in a crisp dress shirt and tailored slacks, a stark contrast to my work-worn appearance. He was meeting some client, and he looked at me with a mixture of surprise and pity. He sauntered over to my table, his eyes flicking over my clothes in a quick, dismissive appraisal. "Wow, I almost didn't recognize you," he said with a condescending chuckle. "What are you up to these days?" Still, between things, the old me would have shrunk under his gaze, stammered some excuse. The new me felt a flicker of annoyance. I decided to give him a simple, unadorned version of the truth. "I'm working for myself now," I said calmly. "I'm flipping a small property." Chad's face broke into a wide, patronizing smirk. He leaned in, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "Oh, that's cute, Margaret. A little hobby project. That's great. Good for you for keeping busy." He patted my shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be encouraging but felt like a pat on a dog's head. "You know," he continued, "Brittany just closed a seven-figure deal on that big commercial lot over by the waterfront. A real monster deal. Maybe she can give you some pointers, so you don't lose your shirt on your little project. She's a killer in this market." He looked so pleased with himself, so certain of his place in the world, so sure of my place at the very bottom. He saw my sawdust-covered clothes and my tired expression, and saw a loser, a nobody playing at being a grown-up. He had no idea he was looking at his future boss's boss. His words, meant to mock me, meant to put me back in the failure box my family had built for me, had the opposite effect. They didn't extinguish my small flame of pride. They poured gasoline on it. A cold, hard resolve settled in my chest. He thought this was a cute little hobby. He thought I needed Brittany's pointers. I just smiled, a small, tight smile. "Thanks, Chad. I'll keep that in mind." He gave my shoulder one last pitying squeeze and walked away, already forgetting about me. I watched him go, the anger solidifying into pure, clean fuel. They would never see me, not until I made it impossible for them not to. This first victory wasn't the end goal. It was just the cornerstone. Now, it was time to build an empire. The profit from the Oakhaven property was the rocket fuel I needed. I didn't pause to celebrate, and I didn't buy myself anything new. Every single dollar, minus a small emergency fund, was immediately reinvested. I was no longer just restoring one building. I was launching an operation. I took the list of properties my grandfather had left me, and with Alistair's legal guidance, officially formed my own company. I sat at my small kitchen table for hours, sketching out logos until I found the right one. A stylized silhouette of a lion, a nod to the stone lions that guarded the entrance to the city library where I first fell in love with history. Inside the outline of a classic gable roof, I filed the paperwork under a name that would give me a layer of anonymity: Vance Legacy Restorations. I was the sole owner, the founder and the CEO. My hobby was now a legitimate business, and I ran it with a ruthless efficiency that would have shocked my family. I moved on to the next two properties on my grandfather's list, simultaneously: a derelict warehouse in the industrial district, and a row of neglected townhouses near the university. The scale was larger, the risks were higher, but this time I wasn't alone. I hired Arthur Jenkins as my full-time site foreman, and his crew of old-school craftsmen worked with a speed and quality that modern construction companies couldn't match. My strategy was simple but effective. While my father and Brittany were chasing massive, high-risk, high-profile projects that required enormous leverage and political maneuvering, I focused on the forgotten corners of the city. I wasn't just restoring buildings, I was revitalizing neighborhoods. The corner bakery in my first building brought foot traffic back to a sleepy street. The restored townhouses near the university provided beautiful, safe housing for students and faculty, driving up property values for blocks around. The warehouse became a stunning co-working space for artists and tech startups, a hub of creativity in a once barren industrial park. My reputation grew quietly but quickly within certain circles. I became known not as Margaret Vance, the family failure, but as the mysterious and brilliant force behind Vance Legacy Restoration. Realtors, investors, and city planners started talking about this new player in the boutique real estate market, someone with the Midas touch for turning urban decay into gold. They praised my company's integrity, our commitment to historical preservation, and our uncanny ability to pick winning projects. My secret transformation was a quiet, internal one. I was no longer just surviving. I was thriving. I moved out of my tiny apartment and into one of the lofts in my first restored building. Waking up every morning in a space I had literally built with my own hands was a powerful feeling. I bought a sensible truck for hauling supplies. My daily uniform was still jeans and boots, but now they were the choice of a boss, not the necessity of a laborer. The irony was thick enough to choke on. My family, so obsessed with status and wealth, had no idea that the useless daughter they had cast aside was quietly building a multi-million-dollar empire right under their noses. They only heard the whispers, the same ones everyone else heard. I knew this because once, while waiting in line for coffee, I overheard two men in suits discussing the red-hot Oakhaven market. "It's all because of that Vance Legacy company," one of them said. "Whoever is running it is a genius. They say everything they touch turns to profit." I had to duck my head to hide my smile, my heart pounding with a thrilling mixture of pride and secrecy. I was no longer poor. I was no longer a nobody. They had called me a failure. So I built a kingdom in the shadows, brick by brick, deal by deal. The secret was my shield and my greatest weapon. They had created their own narrative about me, and I was letting them believe it, all while I was rewriting my own destiny, preparing for the day when my story would finally be made public. The transformation was complete. I was a founder's pal. I was a CEO, and they had absolutely no idea. Vance Legacy Restorations was no longer a secret whispered in niche real estate circles. It was a recognized force in the city, a recent feature in the city's most prominent business journal, which praised the company's visionary approach to urban revitalization, had put us on the mainstream map. I had managed to keep my identity as the CEO under wraps, using Alistair as the public-facing legal counsel, and conducting most high-level business through my formidable foreman, Arthur. To the world, the head of Vance Legacy was an enigma. To my family, I was still just Margaret, the jobless loser living off some unknown, meager savings. One Tuesday evening, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed a name I hadn't seen in over a year. Mom. A cold knot formed in my stomach. My first instinct was to ignore it, to let it go to voicemail, and disappear back into the comfortable anonymity I had built. But a deeper, more powerful curiosity took over. Why now? I swiped to answer, my heart a nervous drum against my ribs. Hello? I said, keeping my voice even and neutral. Margaret? Oh, thank goodness you answered. My mother, Carol's voice was a strange, syrupy concoction of forced warmth and barely concealed desperation. It was the voice she used on bank managers and difficult clients. How are you, darling? It's been too long. I'm fine, Mom, I replied, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. I wasn't fine. I was powerful. I was successful. I was a person she wouldn't even recognize. What's going on? She launched into a flurry of meaningless small talk. The weather, a cousin's new baby, a friend's vacation. I listened silently, waiting for the real reason for the call. It didn't take long. Listen, Margaret. The reason I'm calling is, well, the family has hit a bit of a rough patch, she said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. It's nothing serious, of course, just a minor cash flow problem with your father's pinnacle project. These big ventures, you know how they are. So much money tied up in materials and permits. I remained silent, picturing the monstrous glass tower that had been the subject of my public humiliation. I had been following its progress in the news. It was a financial black hole, plagued by union disputes, permit delays, and skyrocketing material costs. My father and Brittany had overextended, betting the entire company on one flashy, ego-driven project. Anyway, she continued, her voice growing even sweeter. Brittany was talking to someone. She heard a little rumor that that you came into a little money. A small inheritance from a distant relative, she thought. A small inheritance. The lie was so perfectly predictably. Them couldn't conceive of me earning anything. It had to be something that fell into my lap. We were just thinking, my mother said, finally getting to the point. Since you're not burdened with a mortgage or a big career right now, we were wondering if you might be in a position to help the family out. A loan. Just to tide us over until the first pinnacle units sell. Say, $100,000? There it was, the final test. $100,000. A year ago, that number would have been as fantastical as a trip to the moon. Now, it was a rounding error in my company's quarterly earnings. The old me, the broken girl who left that restaurant in tears, would have wept with gratitude. She would have seen this as a chance, a way to buy her way back into their good graces. She would have handed over the money in a heartbeat, desperate for the crumb of acceptance they were offering. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I looked around my beautiful loft, a space built on my own sweat and intelligence. I thought of Arthur and my crew, the people who respected me for my vision, not my last name. I thought of the communities we were rebuilding. They didn't want me. They wanted my money. They weren't offering a hand. They were just reaching for my wallet. I took a deep breath, a profound sense of calm washing over me. The knot in my stomach was gone, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. I'm sorry, Mom, I said, my voice polite but firm. I can't do that. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy and immediate. The fake warmth in her voice vanished, replaced by an icy chill. What do you mean you can't do that? Margaret, this is your family. I have my own financial commitments that I can't compromise, I said, the words feeling powerful and true. I'm not in a position to help. I could almost hear her mind short-circuiting. Her useless poor daughter, who had no commitments and no career, was refusing to hand over a fortune. It was unthinkable. After everything we've done for you, she started, her voice rising with indignation, but I didn't let her finish. I have to go, Mom. Goodbye. I ended the call before she could respond. The line went dead, and the silence in my loft felt different. It wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. The last frayed thread connecting me to my old life had just been severed. There was no going back now. And for the first time, I was truly okay with that. 2 months after that phone call, The world shifted on its axis. The call came not from my mother or my sister, but from a hysterical, sobbing Chad. "Margaret, oh God, Margaret, it's Dad." He wailed into the phone, his voice breaking. "It's Robert. He had a heart attack at the office this morning. A massive one. He didn't make it." The news landed with a dull, distant thud. My father was dead. I felt a strange and hollow ache, a flicker of grief for the father-daughter relationship we never had, for the man he could have been if pride and ambition hadn't consumed him. But that flicker was quickly overshadowed by the cold, hard years of accumulated pain and rejection. I murmured some condolences, my words feeling clumsy and inadequate, and ended the call. The stress from his failing Pinnacle project, the one he had mocked me over, had literally killed him. The irony was bitter. A week later, a week filled with a profound and complicated silence, my sister Brittany called. There was no grief in her voice, it was pure ice, sharp and brittle. "The will reading is on Friday, at the lawyer's office," she said, her tone clipped and businesslike. "Don't bother coming." I was so stunned by the bluntness of it, I couldn't even form a response. "Dad made his wishes very clear," she continued, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "You were a disappointment to him until the end, and you are officially banned from the reading. We don't want you there. Don't make a scene and embarrass us further." Click, she hung up, banned, excluded from even the final chapter of my father's life. It was the ultimate, final rejection. A fresh wave of the old pain washed over me. A testament to the stubborn, foolish part of me that still, after everything, craved their acceptance. I sank onto my sofa, the phone still in my hand, feeling the full weight of being an outcast. But then, just moments later, my phone rang again. This time the caller ID read, "Alistair Finch." I answered, my voice still shaky. "Margaret," he said, his tone calm and grave. "I've just been formally notified by your father's estate. The reading is scheduled for Friday at 10 a.m. "I know," I said, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "I've been banned." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his sharp legal mind. Then he spoke, and his voice held a new charge, a current of triumphant energy. "Oh, have you now?" he said, a hint of a smile in his tone. "How perfect. Perfect. Alistair, they've kicked me out of my own father's will reading." "Margaret," he said, his voice now low and steady, a general rallying his troops before the final battle. "They haven't kicked you out, they have merely set the stage for us. They think they're closing a book, but they're about to find out that you own the whole library. Get your best suit ready, it's time." Friday morning arrived, cool and overcast. The sky the color of slate. It felt like the world was holding its breath. I stood in front of my full-length mirror, not as the paint-splattered girl my family remembered, but as the woman I had become. I was dressed in a sharp, custom-tailored suit of dark charcoal gray. The fabric was immaculate, the cut was precise, and it fit me like a second skin. It was a suit that radiated quiet, unshakable confidence. It was armor. Even so, a knot of cold, hard fear tightened in my stomach. A moment of hesitation, a powerful wave of doubt washed over me. Am I really ready for this? The thought of facing them, of seeing the hatred in my sister's eyes and the disappointment in my mother's, made my hands feel clammy. The little girl inside me, the one who just wanted her father's approval, was screaming to run and hide. My gaze fell on my desk, to a small silver frame. It held a faded photograph of my grandfather, William, and a much younger me. We were standing on a construction site, both of us wearing hard hats that were far too big for my head. He was pointing at something in the distance, and he had a wide, genuine smile on his face. He wasn't looking at the camera, he was looking at me, his eyes filled with pride and affection. He believed in me. That thought, that simple truth, was the anchor I needed. I straightened my shoulders, took a deep breath, and the fear receded, replaced by a steely resolve. I was not doing this for revenge. I was doing this to honor him, the one person who had seen my true worth all along. I met Alistair in the soaring marble-clad lobby of Henderson and Croft, the most prestigious and expensive law firm in the city, my father's firm. Alistair looked impeccable in a dark navy suit, his silver hair neatly combed. He held a handsome leather briefcase that I knew contained the documents that would change everything. He must have seen the last flicker of anxiety on my face, because he gave me a small, reassuring nod. Your grandfather knew this day would come in one form or another, he said, his voice a quiet murmur, amidst the lobby's bustle. He was a great planner, but more than that, he was a great judge of character. He trusted you, Margaret, now trust yourself. His words settled the last of my nerves. He was right. I had spent 2 years building an empire in secret, trusting my instincts, my skills, and my vision. I just needed to trust myself one more time. Together, we walked towards the elevators, our footsteps echoing on the polished marble floor. We rode up to the 40th floor in silence. The doors opened onto a hushed, carpeted hallway lined with intimidatingly closed doors. Alistair led me to a large set of double doors at the end of the hall. Conference room A. They're already in there, he whispered, gesturing for me to wait to the side, out of the direct line of sight from the door. Let them have their moment. The timing must be perfect. I nodded, my heart pounding a steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. I leaned against the cool wall, listening to the muffled voices from within. I was no longer a scared girl walking into an ambush. I was a queen, about to walk into her throne room and find it occupied by squatters. I was walking into the lion's den, but this time, I was the one with the claws. We stood in the hallway, silent sentinels outside the conference room door. The wood was thick and heavy, but it couldn't completely muffle the sounds from within. I could hear the low, somber drone of a lawyer's voice, punctuated by the occasional sniffle from my mother, and the rustle of paper. I closed my eyes, picturing the scene, my family, gathered around a vast, polished table, my sister Brittany, dressed in severe dramatic black, trying to look like a grieving daughter, but radiating an aura of triumphant ambition. My mother Carol, lost in her own world of shattered social standing, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, and Chad, my brother-in-law, sitting awkwardly beside his wife, a useless accessory to the last. Alistair had confirmed the attendance list. Also present was Marcus Thorne, the family's new financial advisor. I had only met him once, briefly, at a disastrous Christmas party years ago. He was a sharp, no-nonsense man in his late 30s, all crisp lines and cool professionalism. He was the neutral observer, a man of numbers and facts, untainted by our family's toxic history. His presence was a strategic gift. The lawyer's voice, which I now recognized as Mr. Henderson, my father's longtime attorney, became clearer. He was reaching the end. And my primary residence, all personal effects, and the remainder of my liquid assets are to be placed in a trust for the sole benefit of my loving wife, Carol Vance, he read in a dry monotone. Finally, I addressed the matter of the company I built, Vance Properties LLC. All of my shares, my title as CEO, and my controlling interest in the board are to be transferred, in their entirety, to my daughter Brittany Vance. I know she will lead it with the strength and vision it requires. Even through the door, I could feel the smug satisfaction radiating from Brittany. This was her coronation. Then, Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. There is one final codicil, a pause. To my other daughter, Margaret, I leave the sum of $1,000 in the hopes that she might one day learn the value of a dollar. The words were a final, posthumous slap in the face, a parting shot from the grave. And then I heard it, a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the somber quiet. It was Brittany, letting out a short, triumphant laugh. It wasn't a sound of grief or solemnity, it was the sound of victory. It was a laugh that said, I won. You lost. You are nothing. Chad followed her lead with a weak, pathetic snicker. They were mocking me. In my father's will reading, a place I was explicitly banned from, they were laughing at my designated portion of the inheritance, an insult wrapped in a pittance. I felt a surge of ice-cold fury, but I pushed it down, channeling it into focus. I looked at Alistair. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Not yet. Inside the room, Mr. Henderson shuffled his papers. This concludes the reading of the last will and testament of Robert Vance. The finality in his voice was the cue. The show was about to begin. The scraping of a chair against the floor signaled the shift in the room. I could hear Brittany's voice, no longer feigning grief, but sharp and full of a new, arrogant authority. Well, Marcus, she said, and I could picture her turning to the financial advisor, a shark smelling blood in the water. It seems we have a lot of work to do. Let's get the paperwork started to transfer control. As the new CEO, I want to see a full accounting of all liquid assets by end of day. Before Marcus Thorne could even reply, Alistair chose his moment. He pushed the heavy conference room door open and stepped inside, his leather briefcase held firmly in his hand. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who knew he held all the cards. The reaction was immediate, a collective gasp. Alistair, my mother Carol said, her voice a confused squeak. What on earth are you doing here? This is a private family matter. Brittany's head snapped towards him, her face a mask of irritation. This is a closed meeting, Alistair. You have no business here. Alistair ignored them both. He walked calmly to the head of the polished table, directly opposite where Brittany sat, and placed his briefcase down with a soft, definitive click. The sound seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. On the contrary, Brittany, he said, his voice level and strong, cutting through the tension. I am here on a matter of the utmost importance, one that directly pertains to the future of Vance Properties. He looked around the table, his gaze lingering for a moment on the surprised face of Mr. Henderson, and then on the cool, inquisitive expression of Marcus Thorne. I am here, Alistair announced, as the executor of the William Vance Family Trust. The name of my grandfather dropped into the room like a granite block. Mr. Henderson stiffened. My mother looked bewildered. It was Brittany who reacted first, a scoff of disbelief on her lips. The what? Granddad's old trust? That was dissolved years ago, she said dismissively. It was not, Alistair corrected her smoothly. It was merely dormant, and its charter, which I have right here, he tapped the briefcase, contains a very specific, non-negotiable clause, a clause that supersedes any will made by his son Robert. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. I could see the scene unfolding in my mind's eye, the dawning confusion, the flicker of fear. The trust's charter is clear, Alistair continued, his voice like a judge's gavel. It states that the true controlling interest of Vance Properties LLC, the shares that William Vance himself established, were never Robert's to give away. They were held in stewardship, and upon Robert's death, full control of all those assets, including the company itself, transfers immediately and irrevocably to the designated chairperson of the trust. The blood drained from Brittany's face. The transformation was stunning. The smug, triumphant CEO-in-waiting vanished, replaced by a pale, trembling woman. The color of her cheeks went from a healthy flush to a pasty, sickly white. What? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Who is the chairperson? Alistair allowed himself a small ghost of a smile. He turned his head slowly and looked directly at the open doorway, where I had been waiting, hidden from view. His next words were not loud, but they landed with the force of a thunderclap, shattering the world my family had built. My client, the owner and new chair of the board, will now join. And on that cue, I stepped through the door. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air in the room seemed to crystallize, time itself slowed down, every head swiveled towards me, a sea of shocked faces caught in a single frozen tableau. I saw my mother's hand fly to her mouth, her eyes wide with utter disbelief. I saw Chad's jaw literally drop, his mouth hanging open in a stupid slack-jawed gape, and I saw my sister, Brittany, her face, which had turned pale at Alistair's words, now contorted into a mask of pure, venomous rage. For a long second, the only sound was the frantic, useless shuffling of papers in Mr. Henderson's hands. The silence was absolute. They were all completely speechless. Brittany was the first to break, the first to find her voice. It came out not as a word, but as a shrill, incredulous cry that clawed at the quiet. You? The word was filled with a decade's worth of scorn. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the floor. Her eyes blazed with fury. This is a joke. This has to be some kind of sick joke, she yelled, pointing a trembling finger at me. You're a loser. You're a failure. You're a nobody. Her words, the same insults they had used to break me, now sounded hollow and desperate. This was the moment. The stage was set, and my supporting cast was ready. Alistair, my ally, stepped forward, placing himself between me and my hysterical sister. His calm authority was a solid wall against her frantic rage. It's no joke, Brittany. he said, his voice cutting and precise. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick, professionally bound portfolio, placing it on the table. For the past 2 years, while you and your father were sinking this company into debt, Margaret has been running Vance Legacy Restorations. He let that sink in before continuing. That's a company she built from the ground up, using only the seed assets her grandfather wisely left her. She turned his forgotten, dilapidated properties into a portfolio of prime real estate. A portfolio, I might add. He slid the document across the polished table towards the one person in the room who truly mattered. That is currently worth more than the debt-ridden company your father was just running into the ground. The portfolio stopped directly in front of Marcus Thorne, the neutral observer. This was his scene. He was the arbiter of truth in this room of lies and emotion. He ignored the family drama completely. His face was a mask of pure, detached professionalism. He didn't look at me or Brittany or Alistair. He looked at the numbers. He opened the portfolio. His sharp eyes scanned the first page, the asset summary. I watched his face carefully. There was no gasp, no dramatic flourish, just a slight, almost imperceptible widening of his eyes. He slowly turned to the second page, the profit and loss statement. He read it, then read it again. Then he lifted his head and looked at me. It wasn't a look of shock, it was a look of pure, unadulterated professional respect. The kind of look my father used to reserve only for his most ruthless competitors. Marcus Thorne, the objective man of finance, gave a slow, definitive nod. "The numbers are staggering," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of final judgment. "The trust is not just solvent, it's massively profitable. Vance Properties, on the other hand," he gestured vaguely at Mr. Henderson's paperwork, "is leveraged to the hilt. The debt-to-asset ratio is critical." His words were the kill shot. The ripple effect was immediate. The legitimacy of my power, of my success, was no longer a claim made by my lawyer. It was a fact, certified by their own expert. The entire dynamic of the room shifted on that single professional assessment. Now it was Chad's turn. Lothars, the mindless coward, saw the titanic shift in power. He saw the validation in Marcus Thorne's eyes, and his survival instincts kicked in. He scrambled to get on the winning side. "Margaret," he stammered, a desperate, sycophantic grin plastered on his face. "I knew it. I always said you had it in you. That fire, we should celebrate. This is fantastic news for the family." I turned my head and gave him a look. It was not a look of anger or triumph. It was a look of pure, cold dismissal. A look that said, "I see you for exactly what you are, and you are nothing." He withered under my gaze, his words dying in his throat. He sat back down, his face flushing with shame, utterly defeated. The crowd of family members had been decimated, the antagonists were isolated, their power was an illusion, and the truth, validated by the neutral observer, had shattered it completely. The room was mine. Brittany stared at me, her face a maelstrom of disbelief and raw, impotent rage. The foundations of her entire world had been pulverized in the span of 5 minutes. The inheritance, the company, the title, the power, it had all been a mirage. "You can't do this," she choked out, her voice raspy with fury. "I am the CEO. Dad gave it to me." I didn't respond to her outburst. Instead, I walked slowly, deliberately, to the head of the table, to the large, ornate leather chair that my father had always occupied, the seat of power. I stood behind it, placing my hands on its back. The worn leather was cool beneath my fingertips. This was not just a chair, it was a throne, and it had been vacant for far too long. I looked directly across the table at my sister, meeting her blazing eyes with a calm, unassailable coolness. My voice, when I finally spoke, was not loud or angry. It was quiet, steady, and devastatingly precise. "You were right about one thing, Brittany," I said, the words falling into the silent room like stones into a still pond. "Dad did leave me nothing. He left me $1,000 to teach me the value of a dollar." I paused, letting her hang on the words. "He did that because he didn't have anything left to give, because grandfather, he already left me everything." The finality of that statement sucked the last bit of air from the room. It was the truth, simple and absolute. My father's will was a meaningless piece of paper. My grandfather's legacy was my reality. Brittany opened her mouth, but only a strangled sound came out. My mother just stared, her face ashen, looking like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and shattered. I then turned my attention away from them, dismissing them as if they were no longer relevant. My gaze shifted to Alistair, who stood beside me, a pillar of quiet support. "Alistair," I said, my voice now crisp and authoritative, the voice of a CEO taking command. "As my first official act as chairwoman of the board of Vance Properties, please contact the bank immediately. I want you to freeze all company credit cards and all corporate lines of credit currently held by Carol and Brittany Vance, effective immediately." My mother let out a sharp, horrified gasp. I wasn't finished. Furthermore, I continued, my eyes briefly flicking to the now very attentive Marcus Thorne, "Please schedule a full independent forensic audit of the last 5 years of all company spending. I want to know where every single dollar has gone." The implication was clear. I wasn't just taking over, I was cleaning house. Brittany looked like she had been physically struck. Her face, already pale, seemed to shrink. She sank back into her chair, her rage collapsing into pure, visceral horror. "The company car," she whispered, her voice a ghost of its former arrogance. "My expense account, my house, the mortgage is in the company's name." Her entire lavish lifestyle, the one she had lorded over me for years, was built on a foundation of sand, and the tide was coming in. I looked at her one last time, my expression unreadable. I felt no pity, no triumph, just a quiet, final sense of closure. "They're not yours anymore," I said. In that moment, I was no longer Margaret, the family failure, the useless nobody. I was Miss Vance, the owner, the ma'am, and the old world had just burned to the ground. Nath. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The silent professional tension of the room exploded into chaos. My final words acted as a detonator. Brittany, faced with the complete and utter demolition of her identity, had a full meltdown. It wasn't the dignified anger of a defeated executive, it was the raw, primal tantrum of a spoiled child who had her favorite toy ripped from her hands. She started screaming, incoherent words of rage and denial, sweeping papers off the conference table. "It's mine. He promised me. It's all mine," she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. Mr. Henderson, flustered and out of his depth, stammered something about security. Alistair, ever prepared, had already made the call. 2 calm, burly men in discreet suits entered the room. They approached Brittany gently but firmly. Her screams turned to sobs as they escorted her from the room, her carefully constructed world collapsing in a storm of tears and impotent fury. My mother, Carol, didn't move. She just sat there, shrunken and gray, staring at the empty space where the architectural model for the Pinnacle project once sat during that fateful birthday dinner. Her entire worldview, a world built on her husband's power and her daughter's ruthless success, had been a fragile house of cards. I had just blown it down with a single breath of truth. She looked small, old, and utterly lost, and Chad, pathetic, cowardly Chad. After Brittany was removed, he scurried over to me, his face a miserable plea. "Margaret, Miss Vance, I am so sorry. I always respected you, really. I did," he began to babble. I didn't even grant him a response, I just turned my back. He got the message, his apology trailing off as he practically ran from the room, a man desperate to escape the wreckage. The room fell quiet again. It was just me, Alistair, and Marcus Thorne. The power dynamic had been irrevocably, seismically broken. The world that had mocked me, the family that had excluded me, was in ruins. Marcus Thorne, who had watched the entire chaotic exit with the detached air of a biologist observing unruly specimens, stood up and straightened his tie. He walked over to me, holding the financial portfolio I had brought. He extended a hand. "Miss Vance," he said, and his voice was filled with a new, profound level of respect. "That was impressive. Your work with Vance Legacy Restorations is nothing short of brilliant." He handed the portfolio back to me. "The board is yours. The company is yours. I'm at your disposal. What would you like me to do first?" His question was simple, professional, and more validating than any apology from my family could ever be. I had won. Not just the argument, not just the company. I had won the respect of the world they so desperately coveted. The transfer of power was absolute. The world that once answered to them, now answered to me. A month later, I stood on the rooftop terrace of the Oakhaven building, my very first project. The sun was setting, casting long golden fingers of light across the city skyline. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the distant sounds of urban life. It was a peaceful sound, the sound of a city breathing, living, growing. Alistair stood beside me, sipping a cup of tea I had made for him. We weren't looking at the past. Spread out on a small table between us were new blueprints, new plans. We were looking at the future. My new vision for Vance Properties, or as I was rebranding it, the Vance Legacy Group, was taking shape. It wasn't about building the tallest, flashiest towers anymore. It was about building communities. The blueprints on the table were for a mixed-use development that incorporated affordable housing, public green spaces, and beautifully restored historic landmarks. It was a project that would generate profit, but it would also generate value for the people who lived there. It was a vision my grandfather would have loved. I hadn't spoken to my mother or my sister since that day in the conference room. The forensic audit had uncovered years of embezzlement and frivolous spending by both my father and Brittany, giving me all the leverage I needed. Brittany was living in a small, rented condo, her assets frozen, facing potential legal action. My mother had quietly retired to a small cottage upstate, paid for by a modest, personally funded trust I had Alistair set up. An act of pity, not forgiveness. I didn't feel a rush of victorious pleasure at their downfall. Instead, I felt a quiet sense of peace. The burning need for their approval had finally been extinguished. Their fall was not the point of my story. It was merely a byproduct of my rise. I looked out at the city, at the lights beginning to twinkle on as darkness fell. I didn't just take my revenge. I had done something more important. I had redeemed my grandfather's name, and I had proven to the world, and more importantly to myself, that my useless passion had real, tangible, world-changing value. My story wasn't about them anymore. It was about the new foundation I was building, a legacy founded not on cruelty and greed, but on resilience, integrity, and self-worth. It was a legacy that was truly mine. My story is proof that the labels other people give you, failure, loser, nobody, only have the power that you allow them to have. True strength isn't about getting revenge, it's about refusing to let their definition of you become your reality. It's about building your own kingdom, even if you have to lay every single brick yourself. What labels have you had to overcome in your own life? What's one name someone called you that you absolutely refuse to accept? Let me know your story in the comments below. I'll be reading them. And if my story resonated with you, if it gave you even a little bit of strength, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about overcoming the odds. Your support means the world. Thanks for watching.